For centuries, the Vatican has existed in the public imagination as a paradox, a spiritual heart built on faith and light, yet surrounded by shadows thick with unanswered questions. To believers, it is the keeper of divine tradition. To historians, it is one of the most powerful institutions ever constructed. And to skeptics, it is something else entirely, a fortress of silence that has learned over time how to speak just enough while hiding everything that truly matters. Every civilization guards its secrets, but few have refined the practice as meticulously as the Vatican. From the earliest days of the Church, knowledge was never merely recorded, it was curated. Texts were copied, altered, preserved, or quietly removed, depending on whether they strengthened authority or threatened it. Over generations, this selective memory transformed into policy, and policy hardened into ritual. What was revealed became doctrine. What was hidden faded into rumor. This reputation did not emerge by accident. The Vatican survived the fall of empires, wars of religion, revolutions, and modern scrutiny by mastering one skill above all others: control of narrative. It learned when to open its doors just wide enough to appear transparent and when to close them without explanation. Official statements are often precise, careful, and incomplete, leaving gaps that invite speculation yet resist confirmation. Most people believe they already know the Vatican secrets. They think of lost gospels, political intrigue, or whispered scandals. But those are the stories allowed to circulate, the ones discussed openly in books, documentaries, and tours. The deeper mystery lies not in what the Vatican has admitted to hiding, but in what it refuses to acknowledge at all. And there is a point where curiosity stops being indulged and starts being discouraged, a boundary where questions are met not with denial, but with silence. And it is at that boundary, far beyond the familiar, legends, that the Vatican's true reputation for secrecy begins, and where few outsiders ever realize they have gone too far. This is where fascination turns uneasy, and the search for answers quietly collides with institutional memory and restraint. The Vatican Apostolic Archive is officially described in language that feels deliberately mundane. According to public statements, it is a scholarly repository, nothing more than a vast library preserving centuries of correspondence, financial records, papal decrees, diplomatic letters, and theological manuscripts. The image presented is almost comforting. Endless shelves of parchment and paper, carefully catalogued, patiently waiting for historians to piece together the slow, administrative story of the Church. In this version of events, the archive is not mysterious at all. It is portrayed as a working tool designed to support academic research and historical accuracy. Researchers apply, credentials are checked, documents are requested, and supervised access is granted. Everything, we are told, follows a clear system. Nothing dangerous, nothing sensational, nothing that would challenge the foundations of belief. Yet historians who have worked inside the archive often describe a different atmosphere, one defined not by what is present, but by what is absent. Catalogs end abruptly. References in older documents point to files that cannot be located. Classifications exist that have no public explanation, marked only by internal codes and restrictions that even seasoned scholars are not permitted to question. The rules themselves raise further unease. Access is narrow, time-limited, and subject to sudden revocation. Entire categories of material remain sealed, not for decades, but indefinitely. When researchers inquire about these limits, answers are polite, consistent, and empty. The archive, they are reminded, contains only what the Church deems appropriate for study. This contrast between the harmless image and the tightly controlled reality leaves an uncomfortable impression. If the archives are exactly what they claim to be, why is so much of their structure hidden? And if there is nothing extraordinary inside, why do so many historians leave with the same quiet feeling that they were never shown the whole room? That lingering doubt follows them long after they exit the Vatican, suggesting that the official description functions less as explanation and more as a carefully constructed boundary between curiosity and knowledge the institution is unwilling to cross publicly ever again. There is one detail that surfaces only at the edges of credible accounts, a space hinted at but never formally acknowledged. Unlike the well-documented halls of the Vatican Apostolic Archive, this room has no label visitors can point to, no plaque, no published floor plan. It does not appear on official diagrams, guided tours never pass near it, and no photograph has ever emerged to confirm its existence. Former researchers describe moments when conversation stopped abruptly, when a question was met with a pause rather than an answer. Mentions of certain storage areas are redirected, reframed, or quietly dismissed. The language becomes careful, almost rehearsed, as though the subject itself violates an unspoken rule. It is not denial that raises suspicion, but avoidance. What makes this room unsettling is not simply that it is restricted. Many archives contain sealed collections. What disturbs historians is that this space seems conceptually removed from the archive altogether, as if it exists outside the system meant to explain it. Requests referencing it vanish into administrative silence. Documentation trails end without resolution. Those who suspect its presence believe it holds material so sensitive that even acknowledging it would invite questions the Vatican cannot answer without consequence. And so the chapter closes with an unresolved tension. If the archive is already secretive by design, what lies beyond its own boundaries? What kind of knowledge requires silence, not just from the public, but from history itself? It remains unseen, unnamed, and officially non-existent, yet its shadow shapes every conversation around the archives. In that absence, speculation grows stronger than evidence, because nothing invites imagination like a locked door no one is willing to admit is there. That silence, more than any rumor, suggests something deliberately kept beyond reach forever. In the earliest centuries of Christianity, belief was not yet fixed, and doctrine was not yet settled. Competing interpretations of Jesus' life and message circulated freely across the Roman world, carried by letters, oral traditions, and handwritten texts. Some communities viewed Christ as divine, others as a teacher, others still as something in between. This diversity posed a problem for a church that was beginning to understand a dangerous truth. Belief without boundaries was impossible to govern. Very early on, church leaders recognized that controlling texts meant controlling faith itself. Gospels that aligned with emerging authority were copied and preserved, while others quietly disappeared. Letters attributed to apostles were debated, filtered, and judged not on authenticity alone, but on usefulness. Canon was not merely discovered, it was decided. What survived shaped theology, and what vanished shaped silence. Lost gospels and suppressed writings hint at this deliberate narrowing of acceptable belief. Entire perspectives on divinity, salvation, and human nature were removed from circulation, not necessarily because they were false, but because they were destabilizing. In this way, secrecy was never an accident of history. It was a strategy born from the realization that ideas, once released, could not be recalled, and some were too powerful to be allowed beyond controlled hands. As the Roman Empire fractured and new powers rose, the Church endured by adapting. One of its most enduring adaptations was physical control over knowledge. Documents were no longer simply stored, they were protected. Early church repositories evolved into guarded spaces, accessible only to trusted clergy. Shelves were categorized not for convenience, but for separation. Historical references from the early medieval period mention restricted collections, rooms accessible only by senior officials, and texts deemed unsuitable for broader clerical study. These were not yet the grand archives of later centuries, but the instinct was already present. Knowledge was something to be preserved and withheld at the same time. Locked rooms became symbols of authority. To hold the key was to hold power, not just over information, but over interpretation. What was read shaped belief, and what was unseen shaped obedience. Over generations, this approach hardened into tradition. Preservation and exclusion became inseparable, suggesting that secrecy was no longer reactive. It was becoming instinctive, embedded in the institution's survival mechanisms. Not all scholars accepted these boundaries quietly. Throughout history, individuals within the church pushed against limitations, seeking older texts, alternative interpretations, and forgotten records. Some were gently redirected, others were warned. A few found themselves abruptly isolated from resources they once freely accessed. Curiosity, once celebrated as devotion, began to carry risk. Asking the wrong question could end a career or invite suspicion. The danger was not always punishment, but silence. Doors closed without explanation. Correspondence went unanswered. Opportunities vanished. The message was clear without ever being stated. Secrecy, in this light, functioned as protection not only of faith, but of authority. Certain truths, if revealed, could fracture unity, undermine leadership, or expose decisions made long ago under pressure. The church learned that stability often depended on not revisiting certain paths. Some knowledge was not heretical, but inconvenient, and therefore too dangerous to survive public exposure. As access narrowed, imagination filled the gaps. Stories began circulating of rooms no one could enter, shelves sealed indefinitely, and documents whispered about but never seen. Over time, these rumors outgrew their origins. Fact blurred into legend, and legend hardened into expectation. Even centuries ago, visitors to Rome spoke of forbidden collections guarded by ritual and silence. Monks hinted at texts that contradicted official history. Scholars speculated about records older than the church itself. No one could verify these claims, but no one could fully dismiss them either. The absence of clarity became fertile ground for myth. And yet, myths often grow around something real. The chapter closes on an unsettling question that has echoed for generations. Were these stories exaggerated fantasies born of ignorance, or early warnings passed down by those who glimpsed something they were never meant to fully understand? When the Vatican announced that the Vatican Secret Archive would be renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archive, the decision was presented as a simple clarification. The word secret, officials explained, never meant hidden, only private. It referred to the Pope's personal archive, not a vault of forbidden knowledge. The change, they said, was meant to prevent misunderstanding and encourage openness in an age of suspicion. On the surface, the explanation sounded reasonable. Language evolves and institutions adapt, but to historians and observers, The timing felt uneasy. The renaming came during a period of increasing public scrutiny when interest in Vatican secrecy was growing rather than fading. Documentaries, books, and digital archives were drawing attention to what remained inaccessible, not what had already been released. Critics quietly asked an uncomfortable question: if nothing about the archive's contents or policies had changed, why did the name need to change at all? The shelves were the same. The restrictions remained. The locked doors did not open. Only the label was altered, as though reshaping perception could substitute for transparency. To some, the renaming felt less like clarification and more like insulation. Removing the word secret softened the image, but did not address the deeper issue of control. It suggested an institution keenly aware of how it is seen and willing to adjust language while leaving substance untouched. In doing so, it reinforced a familiar pattern. When pressure builds, the Vatican rarely reveals more. Instead, it reframes the conversation, guiding attention away from what still lies beyond reach, unchanged and unexamined. Gaining entry to the modern Vatican archive is often described as a privilege, and the process ensures it remains exactly that. Scholars must apply years in advance, present credentials, letters of recommendation, and clearly defined research topics. Even when approval is granted, access is narrow. Requests are limited, materials are delivered selectively, and every visit unfolds under quiet supervision. Researchers are not free to browse. They cannot wander aisles or follow leads instinctively. Instead, they submit written requests and wait for documents deemed appropriate to be retrieved for them. Entire categories of material are off limits without explanation. Some are sealed by date, others by subject, and some appear closed indefinitely. These rules create an illusion of openness while preventing comprehensive understanding. No single scholar can see enough to connect broader patterns. No one is permitted to explore freely enough to challenge the structure of what is presented. Knowledge arrives in fragments, curated and incomplete, making independent conclusions nearly impossible. More revealing is who never gains access at all. Independent researchers, journalists, and unconventional historians are excluded outright. Even within academic circles, permissions can be quietly revoked. The system ensures that only those operating within accepted frameworks are allowed inside, and even then, only briefly. In this way, the archive remains visible yet distant, accessible yet unknowable, open enough to appear transparent, but controlled enough to ensure no one ever sees the full picture at once. Among historians who have worked inside the archive, a subtle pattern emerges in private conversations. It's not what they find that unsettles them most, but what they cannot find. References appear in letters to documents that no longer exist in catalogs. Citations lead to shelf numbers that yield nothing. Older inventories hint at collections that seem to have vanished without record. These absences are rarely acknowledged officially. When questioned, archivists respond with polite uncertainty or redirect inquiries entirely. The implication is always the same. If a document cannot be produced, it is either misplaced, reclassified, or unsuitable for consultation. No further explanation follows. Over time, these gaps accumulate, a missing letter here, an unavailable report there, until the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Scholars begin to suspect that absence itself is intentional, that some materials are not lost but removed from visibility so completely they leave only faint echoes behind. This realization changes how the archive is perceived. It becomes less a storehouse of preserved history and more a carefully edited narrative. What remains visible tells one story. What is missing hints at another. And in that tension, unease grows. Because when an institution devoted to record keeping cannot account for its own omissions, the silence speaks louder than any document ever could. Beneath the polished marble and ceremonial grandeur of Vatican City lies a far older, more complex world of stone corridors and buried passageways. Over centuries, renovations have layered new structures atop ancient foundations, creating an underground geometry that even modern engineers struggle to fully map. Some staircases end abruptly at sealed walls. Corridors appear on internal plans, but lead nowhere. Other routes exist physically, but never appear on official blueprints at all. These irregularities are often explained as relics of age, the natural result of building atop history, yet records show deliberate modifications that were never publicly documented. Walls erected where hallways once ran, doorways bricked over during renovations that required no structural change, spaces removed from circulation rather than repurposed. To architects and historians, this suggests intention rather than decay. The Vatican's underground is not chaotic, it is selective. And in a place defined by ritual and record keeping, every omission carries weight. The question quietly emerges. If certain rooms were erased from maps, was it to protect them from collapse or from discovery? Direct testimony about the room without a name is rare, but it exists in fragments, usually shared only after retirement, when loyalty softens into reflection. Former archivists describe strict hierarchies of access, where even within the archive, certain areas were known only to a few. These individuals never describe what they saw, only what they were told not to ask. One recalls keys that were never logged, transferred hand to hand without documentation. Another remembers instructions to deliver materials to a location he was never permitted to enter. Conversations would halt when the subject arose. Supervisors became distant. Curiosity was quietly discouraged. What makes these accounts unsettling is their consistency. Different individuals, separated by decades, describe the same boundaries. None claim certainty, yet none deny the room's existence. They speak as though acknowledging it directly would still violate an oath long after it expired. In their restraint, something becomes clear. This is not secrecy enforced by fear alone. It is secrecy maintained by culture, passed down carefully, teaching each generation what questions are better left unformed. Among the most troubling clues are records that exist without explanation. Internal inventories list storage units identified only by numbers or letters, accompanied by no summaries, no dates, and no classifications. In institutions obsessed with detail, such omissions are extraordinary. Historians reviewing these fragments note how unusual it is for archivists to catalog space without content. Even the most sensitive materials are typically described in coded language. Here there is nothing, just the acknowledgement that something occupies a place without any indication of what or why. Attempts to trace these listings lead nowhere. Cross-references fail. Earlier catalogs do not clarify them. Later ones quietly omit them altogether. The effect is disorienting, as though a shadow were recorded rather than an object. What kind of material cannot even be summarized? Not classified, but undescribed. Not hidden, but undefined. The absence feels intentional, suggesting that the act of description itself was considered too revealing to commit to paper. Unlike restricted files or sealed collections, The room without a name seems to exist outside normal systems of control. It is not governed by timelines or declassification schedules. It is not debated publicly or defended privately. It is simply avoided. This suggests a different purpose entirely. Secrecy usually protects information. Containment protects consequences. The distinction matters. If certain knowledge threatens belief, authority, or stability, locking it away may not be enough. It must also be removed from language, memory, and acknowledgement. This room appears culturally off limits, not just administratively restricted. It is treated as something that should not even enter discourse. That restraint implies fear not of exposure, but of impact, of what might happen if its contents were known to exist at all. And so the chapter closes on a chilling implication. This is not about hiding history. It is about isolating it, about keeping something so disruptive, so unresolved that even silence is considered safer than explanation. In the centuries before the Christian canon was fixed, stories about Jesus circulated widely, carried by communities that understood his message in profoundly different ways. Some texts portrayed him as divine from birth, others as a teacher chosen later in life, and some emphasized secret knowledge revealed only to a few. These writings were not fringe fantasies. They were read, copied, and revered by early believers who saw no contradiction in their existence. When church leaders began assembling an official canon, these alternative gospels posed a problem. They complicated theology, blurred authority, and challenged the idea of a single, unified truth. Texts that conflicted with emerging doctrine were labeled apocryphal and gradually removed from circulation. Some were destroyed, others were hidden, forgotten, or survived only through fragments quoted by critics. The question that lingers is not whether these gospels existed, but why some vanished so completely. Were they flawed or simply inconvenient? If certain versions of Christ's life threatened the stability of belief, their disappearance may not have been accidental. It may have been deliberate, leaving behind only echoes of stories considered too disruptive to endure. Modern Christianity often presents itself as a direct continuation of an unbroken tradition, but historical evidence suggests something far more fragmented. Early Christian communities disagreed on fundamental issues: the nature of Jesus, the meaning of salvation, the role of women, and the authority of leadership. These debates were not minor disagreements. They defined what it meant to be Christian. Different groups preserved different texts, each reinforcing their worldview. Some emphasized mystical knowledge, others strict morality, others communal equality. There was no single center, no universal authority, only networks of belief connected by shared stories but divided by interpretation. Orthodoxy, as it exists today, emerged from this chaos through selection rather than consensus. Church councils eventually formalized doctrine, choosing which beliefs would define Christianity and which would be condemned as heresy. This process created unity, but at the cost of erasure. Entire traditions were written out of history. If the Vatican Archives preserve records from this formative period, they may contain evidence that challenges the idea of inevitability, that what we now call orthodoxy was not destiny, but decision. Such proof would not merely revise history, it would redefine authority itself, suggesting that belief systems are shaped as much by power as by truth. The possibility that belief depends on omission is unsettling, yet unavoidable. Faith thrives on clarity, on narratives that feel stable and complete. Introducing contradictory truths, especially foundational ones, risks replacing certainty with doubt. For institutions built on continuity, doubt is dangerous. If certain texts reveal that doctrine evolved through compromise, suppression, or political necessity, faith may feel less sacred and more constructed. For many believers, that distinction matters deeply. Silence, in this sense, becomes a form of protection, preserving meaning by limiting exposure. This raises a troubling question. Is faith stronger when sheltered from complexity or weakened by it? The Vatican's long history of restraint suggests a clear answer. Some truths, once known, cannot be reconciled easily with belief, and so they are not denied, but withheld, quietly locked away where they cannot unravel what generations have been taught to trust without question. Across centuries of secondary citations, historians have encountered strange references that seem to defy accepted timelines. Mentions of advanced engineering concepts appear centuries before such knowledge is believed to exist. Descriptions of cities with impossible ages surface briefly in correspondence, only to disappear from later records. These anomalies are rarely discussed openly, often dismissed as copying errors or exaggerations by medieval writers. Yet what troubles researchers is consistency. Similar references appear in unrelated documents across regions and eras, suggesting a shared source now missing. Scholars trace these citations backward only to reach sealed collections or dead ends within Vatican-controlled materials. The originals, if they still exist, are inaccessible. Some references hint at civilizations predating accepted history, possessing knowledge that challenges linear progress narratives. Others suggest astronomical awareness far beyond the supposed capabilities of ancient societies. Alone, each fragment can be ignored. Together, they form a pattern that refuses to disappear. The absence of the original documents becomes the mystery itself. If these claims were harmless fiction, why were they not preserved as curiosities? Why remove them entirely? The idea emerges that certain records did not simply contradict doctrine, but destabilized humanity's understanding of its own past. What remains are echoes without sources, shadows of a history that does not fit comfortably within established frameworks. And so these fragments linger, unresolved, pointing toward documents deliberately kept beyond reach, waiting silently where history is not meant to follow. Time is not merely a measure of years, it is a structure that shapes authority. Religious legitimacy often rests on chronology, on the claim of continuity from sacred origins to present leadership. If timelines shift, authority shifts with them. This makes control over historical dating far more than an academic concern. The Vatican has long played a central role in preserving and interpreting historical records. Decisions about dates, eras, and transitions influence how events are understood. A single adjustment to chronology can redefine precedence, succession, and divine mandate. What appears minor on paper can have enormous theological consequences. Scholars note that some historical periods remain unusually vague, compressed, or fragmented in official records. Entire centuries appear thinner than others, raising questions about whether gaps reflect loss or deliberate smoothing. Alternative chronologies proposed outside church approval rarely gain traction, not because they lack evidence, but because they lack institutional endorsement. If documents exist that challenge established timelines, their release would force a reckoning. It could undermine long-held assumptions about when civilizations rose, when doctrines formed, and when authority was claimed. Control over time then becomes control over narrative. In this light, sealed documents are not just hidden facts. They are safeguards protecting a carefully constructed historical order, one where timing supports legitimacy and legitimacy sustains power across generations. History provides societies with stability, a shared understanding of where they come from and why things are the way they are. When that foundation is challenged, the consequences extend far beyond academia. Belief systems, identities, and institutions all rely on historical coherence. If evidence emerged proving that accepted history was incomplete or manipulated, trust would erode rapidly. Questions would multiply. What else was altered? Who decided what remained? And why were those decisions made? For religious institutions, such revelations could fracture belief at its core, transforming faith into skepticism. The cost of rewriting the past is not limited to religion. Political authority, cultural identity, and moral frameworks are all shaped by historical narratives. Changing them would destabilize societies accustomed to certainty. Even truth, when disruptive enough, can become a threat to cohesion. This helps explain resistance to revisiting foundational records. Preserving stability may feel more responsible than pursuing complete accuracy. In that calculation, omission becomes justification. The danger lies in the long term. Suppressed truths do not disappear. They accumulate pressure. When released suddenly, they can overwhelm understanding. Perhaps this risk, more than fear of exposure, explains why certain histories remain sealed, deemed too costly to correct in a world built upon them. There is a final consideration that haunts every discussion of forbidden knowledge. Once something is revealed, it cannot be unseen. Awareness reshapes perception permanently. For individuals and institutions alike, revelation is irreversible. If documents exist that fundamentally alter humanity's understanding of its past, their release would not simply inform, it would transform. Long-held beliefs would fracture, replaced by uncertainty and reinterpretation. Some would adapt, others would resist. Many would feel unmoored. Institutions tasked with stewardship of knowledge may ask not whether people deserve truth, but whether they are prepared for it. History shows that societies often struggle when confronted with information that dismantles shared meaning. Chaos does not require malice. It only requires sudden disruption. From this perspective, containment becomes an act of caution, not moral superiority, but risk management. The fear is not that people would learn something terrible, but that they would learn something destabilizing. This idea reframes secrecy entirely. What is hidden may not be monstrous, but transformative. Knowledge powerful enough to reorder belief itself. And so it remains sealed, not because it is false, but because once revealed, the world that follows may not resemble the one carefully maintained until now. Among the most persistent and controversial rumors surrounding the Vatican archives is the claim that written correspondence from the lifetime of Jesus may exist. Not gospels written decades later, but letters exchanged between Roman officials, regional authorities, or early witnesses who encountered the events firsthand. These claims surface repeatedly across centuries, appearing in marginal notes, second-hand accounts, and private testimonies from scholars who insist they encountered references they were never allowed to pursue. The idea itself is explosive. If such letters exist, they would anchor biblical events to contemporary political reality, reframing Jesus not only as a religious figure, but as a documented presence within the Roman administrative world. Mentions of unrest, trials, or local disturbances could radically alter how the story is understood. Yet no such documents have ever been released, authenticated, or even officially acknowledged. What deepens the mystery is the Vatican's response, or lack of one. These claims are never publicly denied. They are not dismissed as hoaxes or fantasies. Instead, they are met with silence so complete it feels deliberate. In an institution known for precise language, refusal to address such rumors stands out. Some historians argue the silence is practical, meant to avoid amplifying speculation. Others suspect something more cautious. If even fragments of such correspondence survived, their interpretation could destabilize centuries of theology, and so the question lingers, unresolved. Are these rumors echoes of something real, quietly preserved, or are they myths sustained precisely because no one in authority will ever confirm what lies just beyond the reach of official history? In recent decades, the Vatican has displayed a surprising openness toward the possibility of non-human intelligence. Vatican astronomers speak calmly about extraterrestrial life. High-ranking clergy state publicly that belief in aliens does not conflict with faith. Conferences are held, dialogues encouraged. The tone is measured, curious, and almost welcoming. This openness stands in sharp contrast to the archive's silence on related historical material. If the Church is comfortable discussing the existence of life beyond Earth, why does it remain so guarded about ancient records that may hint at similar ideas? Some researchers point to medieval texts referencing beings descending from the heavens, interpreted traditionally as angels, but described in oddly physical terms. The contrast is unsettling. Public speculation is permitted. Historical documentation is not. This suggests the issue is not belief, but evidence. Abstract discussion poses little threat. Concrete records do. If the archives contain material suggesting ancient encounters were interpreted through theology rather than understood technologically, the implications would be profound. Faith, history, and humanity's place in the universe would blur together uncomfortably, and so the Vatican speaks freely about the future while remaining silent about the past, where documentation, not imagination, may tell a far more disruptive story. Institutions often respond to uncomfortable claims with denial. They issue statements, corrections, and rebuttals. The Vatican, however, frequently chooses a different strategy. Silence, no clarification, no engagement, no acknowledgement. Over time, this pattern becomes meaningful in itself. Silence prevents escalation, but it also preserves ambiguity. By refusing to deny rumors outright, the Vatican avoids committing to a narrative that might later unravel. Denial can be disproven. Silence cannot. It allows space for speculation without validation, keeping authority intact while curiosity lingers unresolved. For researchers, this silence is deeply frustrating. It blocks inquiry without confrontation. It closes doors without explaining why. Yet it also signals boundaries more clearly than any prohibition ever could. Certain questions are not welcome, not because they are false, but because they are dangerous to pursue. In this way, silence becomes a form of communication. It suggests that some subjects are too sensitive to address publicly and too complex to dismiss. The absence of denial implies awareness. The refusal to engage implies risk. And so the rumors persist, not because they are confirmed, but because they are never erased. They exist in the space created by institutional quiet, growing stronger with every unanswered question. In the end, the Vatican's silence speaks volumes. hinting that what it chooses not to say may be more revealing than anything it could ever admit aloud. Access to the Vatican archives is never guaranteed, but for some scholars, it has vanished without warning. Researchers recount moments when long-approved permissions were abruptly withdrawn, sometimes in the middle of ongoing projects. No formal explanation followed. Emails went unanswered. Requests were returned with vague references to administrative review or changed circumstances. What links these cases is not misconduct, but curiosity. In several instances, access was revoked shortly after scholars requested specific collections or referenced obscure documents connected to early doctrine, anomalous timelines, or sealed inventories. The timing was too precise to ignore. One historian described the experience as walking through an invisible boundary without realizing it existed. There were no confrontations, no accusations. The withdrawal itself was the message. By cutting off access quietly, the institution avoided scandal while enforcing limits no one could openly describe. Careers built on archival research suddenly stalled, not through rejection, but through silence. For those affected, the loss felt personal and chilling. Years of preparation dissolved overnight. The implication was unmistakable. Some lines of inquiry are tolerated only until they approach something the archive does not want disturbed, and once crossed, the door closes without appeal. Beyond revoked permissions lie subtler consequences. Some scholars who pushed too far did not lose access immediately, but found opportunities slowly disappear. Invitations declined, grants quietly denied, publishing avenues narrowed. Their work was not censored, but it was no longer welcomed. Within academic circles, reputations are fragile. Being labeled difficult or speculative can isolate a researcher without formal reprimand. Several historians who questioned canonical narratives or referenced missing documents found themselves marginalized, their careers fading not through failure but through absence of support. No official policy enforces these outcomes. That is what makes them effective. Boundaries are learned informally through observation and cautionary examples. Younger scholars notice who advanced and who stalled. Over time, curiosity adapts itself to survival. The result is a culture of restraint. Questions remain unasked, not because they lack merit, but because pursuing them carries invisible risk. The cost of curiosity becomes professional exile, enforced not by decree, but by consensus. And so, careers quietly end, serving as warnings without words. For the few who glimpse fragments of forbidden material, the impact is not always intellectual. Some describe a profound sense of disorientation, as though familiar historical anchors had shifted beneath them. Ideas they once trusted felt unstable. Narratives they relied on no longer aligned. These individuals rarely speak publicly. When they do, their accounts are cautious, fragmented, and emotionally restrained. They mention unease rather than revelation, fear rather than certainty. One described the sensation as carrying a secret that reshaped everything, while being unable to explain why. Silence often follows, not enforced silence, but chosen withdrawal. Knowing something destabilizing without context or confirmation can be isolating. It creates distance between the knower and the world that continues unchanged. This psychological toll suggests that the danger of certain knowledge lies not only in what it reveals, but in what it removes. Certainty, belonging, trust in established truth. Once disturbed, these do not easily return. The idea that knowledge can be harmful feels counterintuitive. Yet history offers examples where revelation caused upheaval rather than progress. Within the Vatican's long memory, this lesson may be deeply ingrained. Some truths, once known, cannot be integrated smoothly into society. This raises an unsettling possibility. That secrecy is not always about power, but about protection, not of institutions, but of individuals, shielding scholars from truths that might isolate, destabilize, or overwhelm them. If certain records fundamentally alter humanity's understanding of faith, history, or itself, then exposure becomes a responsibility as much as a right. The burden of knowing may outweigh the benefit of disclosure. Whether this justification is compassionate or paternalistic remains unresolved, but the pattern is clear. Those who come too close often step back, voluntarily or not, and the knowledge they sought remains sealed, not because it lacks importance, but because it carries a weight. Few are prepared to bear alone. If the door to the unnamed room were opened, the first tremors would not be political or cultural, but theological. Doctrine depends on continuity, on the belief that truth has flowed unbroken from sacred origins to the present. If documents emerged that contradicted foundational teachings, that continuity would fracture. Faith would be forced into dialogue with doubt, not as a philosophical exercise, but as an existential crisis. Believers might ask whether doctrine was divinely guided or historically negotiated. Teachings long presented as eternal could be revealed as adaptive, shaped by circumstance rather than revelation. For many, this would not merely revise belief, but undermine trust. Faith is sustained not only by ideas, but by confidence in their source. Some would reinterpret adapting belief to new understanding. Others would resist, clinging more tightly to tradition. Schisms could form not along denominational lines, but along responses to truth itself. The shock waves would not end quickly. They would ripple through seminaries, congregations, and personal identities. The greatest strain would fall on meaning. If the story changes, what remains sacred? The opening of the room would force faith to confront its own history, and not all belief systems survive that confrontation intact. The Vatican is not only a religious authority, but a political one. It maintains diplomatic relations with nations, influences policy debates, and shapes moral discourse worldwide. Revelations from the archive room would therefore extend far beyond theology, touching governments, cultures, and global stability. Documents challenging historical narratives could destabilize national identities built on religious legitimacy. Alliances formed under moral authority might weaken. Political movements grounded in tradition could lose coherence. In regions where faith and governance are deeply intertwined, the consequences could be severe. The Vatican's credibility itself would be questioned. Why were these materials withheld? Who decided they were too dangerous to share? Trust, once broken, is difficult to restore, especially on a global scale. Media amplification would intensify the impact. Partial truths, misinterpretations, and speculation would spread faster than context. The room's contents would not emerge into a calm world of scholarship, but into a volatile environment hungry for certainty and scandal. In this sense, the danger is not only what is revealed, but how it is received. The Vatican silence may reflect awareness that global systems are fragile, and that truth, when released without preparation, can fracture more than it enlightens. The final question is not whether humanity deserves the truth, but whether it is prepared to live with it. Readiness is rarely discussed, yet it may be the most important factor of all. History shows that Societies struggle when foundational narratives collapse faster than new ones can form. If the room contains knowledge that redefines human origins, belief, or purpose, the shock could exceed our capacity to adapt. Meaning would erode before alternatives emerge. In that vacuum, fear often grows. This possibility reframes secrecy as timing rather than denial, not a rejection of truth, but a postponement. The belief that some knowledge requires a cultural maturity not yet achieved. Whether this judgment is justified remains open. Critics argue humanity never becomes ready without challenge. Defenders argue caution prevents chaos. Between these positions lies the locked door. Perhaps the room remains closed, not because of what it contains, but because of what it would unleash. A truth that cannot be unseen, unlearned, or undone. And until the world can absorb such knowledge without tearing itself apart, the silence endures. Heavy with implications humanity may not yet be prepared to face. The Vatican's refusal to confirm or deny the existence of the unnamed archive room is often interpreted as evasion, but over time it begins to look more like strategy. Denial invites argument. Confirmation invites demand. Silence, however, freezes the conversation in place, allowing speculation without surrendering control. It is a posture refined over centuries of surviving controversy. By neither acknowledging nor rejecting rumors, the Vatican avoids creating an official narrative that could later be challenged. Words, once spoken, cannot be retrieved. Ambiguity preserves flexibility. It allows the institution to adapt quietly without committing to explanations that may unravel under scrutiny. This approach also reinforces authority. When questions receive no answer, boundaries become implicit rather than enforced. People learn where inquiry ends without being told directly. Silence becomes a signal understood by scholars, journalists, and believers alike. Rather than absence of response, this ambiguity functions as a carefully maintained presence. It shapes discourse by limiting it. In doing so, the Vatican positions itself above speculation, neither validating nor engaging, while retaining control over what enters official history. The result is frustration for outsiders and stability for the institution. Ambiguity protects not only secrets, but sovereignty over truth itself. And so the Vatican says nothing, not because it has nothing to say, but because saying nothing has proven far more powerful across time. The unnamed room may represent more than institutional secrecy. It may reflect humanity's own discomfort with destabilizing truth. Throughout history, societies have struggled when familiar narratives collapse. We depend on stories that explain who we are, where we came from, and why meaning exists at all. When those stories are threatened, resistance follows. Denial, anger, fear. Institutions often become the focus of blame, but they also serve as buffers, absorbing tension that might otherwise fracture societies outright. In this sense, the room becomes a mirror, reflecting collective anxiety rather than unilateral control. The Vatican, like any ancient institution, is shaped by human limitations. It guards not only doctrine, but continuity. If certain truths undermine shared meaning, withholding them may feel like preservation rather than deception. This reframing shifts responsibility outward. The question becomes not what the Vatican is hiding, but what humanity is unwilling to face. Are we prepared to reimagine belief, history, and identity without collapsing into chaos? If the answer is no, then the locked room is not merely a vault, it is a pause, a holding space for truths that challenge more than authority. It reflects our fear of losing certainty. and the unsettling realization that some knowledge reshapes us beyond recognition. History is often imagined as fixed, but it is closer to a conversation interrupted. Documents survive, others vanish, gaps remain where answers should be. The Vatican Archives embody this incompleteness, holding fragments that suggest stories not yet told. What history is waiting to reveal may not be dramatic revelations, but subtle revisions that change perspective rather than facts. A letter that reframes motive, a record that shifts timing, a text that complicates belief. These details matter because they shape meaning. The unanswered questions persist deliberately. They invite inquiry while resisting closure. Scholars speculate, theories emerge, and interest endures. In this way, mystery sustains engagement with the past, preventing history from becoming complacent. Yet waiting implies intention, that some truths are deferred rather than lost, that history is not finished speaking, only paused. The archives stand as a reminder that what we know is provisional, shaped by access as much as evidence. Perhaps the greatest lesson is humility, that certainty is fragile and understanding incomplete. History waits not because it has nothing to say, but because the moment to speak has not yet arrived. Until then, the silence endures, heavy with possibilities still sealed beyond reach. The story ends not with revelation, but with restraint. The door to the unnamed room remains closed, not rusted or forgotten, but deliberately maintained. Its persistence suggests intention rather than neglect. Perhaps the room stays locked, not because humanity is unworthy, but because change is irreversible. Once opened, belief cannot return to its former shape. Authority cannot reclaim innocence. History cannot be unlearned. Some doors close to protect what lies behind them. Others close to protect those standing outside. The distinction matters. If the room contains truths capable of unraveling meaning itself, then secrecy becomes less about power and more about consequence. This possibility leaves us unsettled. It suggests that the greatest mysteries are not hidden out of malice, but caution. That silence may be chosen not to deceive, but to delay an impact no one fully understands. And so, the door remains closed, not as an insult to curiosity, but as a reminder that knowledge carries weight, that some truths, once known, reshape the world so completely that nothing afterward is ever the same again.